This program is a presentation of University of California Television. Your support makes UCTV's programming possible. Contribute online at uctv.tv/support. Check out our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, at youtube.com/UCTV Prime. Subscribe today to get new programs every week.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased that you've made it to the third of the mini med school. You've met me before, but I haven't really introduced myself, but I'll be speaking tonight. My name is Kieran Leslie. My accent might give a clue that I'm not from these parts. I'm from the United Kingdom, where I trained in medicine and dermatology and have been on faculty at UCSF for the last 7 years. And I'm going to talk a little bit different from the other talks. And my talk is split into two, and I've called it the old and the new. The new comes from I do clinical research and clinical trials, and the old is that I'm a very average student of history, and I want to tell you about two stories that I was involved in, which I came across in my career. I'm going to start with the new. Okay. And I just want to disclose that I've been involved doing clinical trials, and I've been an investigator on a drug that I'm going to mention, made by a pharmaceutical company called Novartis. So I wanted just to disclose that. Now, are you all sitting comfortably? Because I want to tell you a story. And the story really began for me about 33 years ago. This is me. I'm age 7. And I watched this film. Has anyone seen this film? The Magic Bullet? So this is an old black and white film with Edward G. Robinson, and he's playing Paul Ehrlich. Now, Paul Ehrlich was a German physician who dedicated his life to trying to find a cure for syphilis. And he called this the magic bullet. And in the sort of 1930s Hollywood movie, they never mentioned syphilis as the disease he's trying to cure for the whole hour and a half of the film. But it struck me at age 7. I thought, that's pretty cool. You kind of get this horrible disease. I didn't know what syphilis was, and no one told me in the film anyway. But it certainly was, very bad news. And yet you could find this magic bullet and make somebody well. And I kind of thought, well, maybe I'll go to medical school and see if I can do that. And indeed, when I got to medical school, I kind of was interested in cancer. Actually, is where I started off. And I was an intern in oncology, and I was dealing with patients with leukemia and lymphoma. And the good news about leukemia and lymphoma is that these are cancers that often are curable. The bad news is that a lot of people die, even today. And I decided that at that point, there really was no magic bullet in cancer, so I looked elsewhere. And then I thought, well, what about, infectious diseases? I had a great interest in that. I trained in infectious diseases. And this was about the late 1990s, and we were working in tuberculosis. And there was increasing cases of multi-drug resistant TB. And I kind of thought, damn, we've missed another magic bullet. So after that, I just gave up with the whole thing. They just didn't exist. And I thought, well, I'll just become a dermatologist and shoot Botox. Anyway, so let me go to my dermatological career. So I finished my training in medicine, and I went off. I got accepted into a dermatology program, and where I started was a place called King's Lynn. Now, has anyone been to King's Lynn? No. Is anyone here from Bakersfield? Good. So King's Lynn, as they say, is a good place to be from, kind of like Bakersfield. And it has a population of 1 cow. And that's where I started my dermatology career. And my first morning as a trainee, as a resident, the attending physician said, "Thank God you're here. We've got this very difficult case, this family, with this horrible disease, and we want you to do something with them." And I was like, this is my first morning. I can't even spell psoriasis. And they're saying, "We want you to cure these people." And I said, "Well, what's the disease?" And the attending said, it's Muckle-Wells syndrome. So I went off to the library. I'd never heard of it. Went off to the library, and I got out the big British textbook in dermatology. It's in 4 volumes. It's this big. And there were 2 lines in this book on Muckle-Wells saying hives, urticaria, the medical term for hives, and deafness. And I was like thinking, well, I don't know, maybe this is what I'm going to see. So I met a family that afternoon. And I actually was the first trainee in this hospital. So they had attendings, but they had no trainees. So they were pinning a lot of hope on me as the trainee that I could kind of do something. But I've explained, I was in a hospital like in a field. I didn't have a laboratory, and I'm not a scientist. But I met this woman who was 34 years of age at that time. And she had this history of hives that she'd had every day of her life. And the problem for her is that her 2 sons also had the same problem. Her sons, I think at that time, were maybe 8 and 4. So the 3 of them came in, and I looked at them, and this is what they looked like. There's actually a picture of, this was when the younger son was a baby, so I saw him when he was a bit older. But they had this blotchy rash on their arms, that they told me kind of moved around, a little bit on the face. This was, obviously in the sort of infancy period, and they're very sort of dramatic. And then taking a family history, the patient, the mother who brought in her children, her mother had died from kidney failure. And she had a brother and a sister, so that's the uncle and aunt of the 2 children, who also had a similar rash. She also had 3 siblings which were not affected. None of them were deaf. It didn't really look like regular hives to me. We see a lot of hives, and I bet most of this audience have had hives at some point in their life, after an allergy or medication or just after a flu or something like that. But it didn't really look like hives. But I didn't have a better term for it. They weren't deaf, and that was the other thing which sort of concerned me. Anyway, there was no treatment for this poor woman and her children. And we had no idea what caused this problem, and they were just looking at me really desperately. And I think at this point, I want to actually play a video of somebody with the same disease. This is actually an American family. This is from a website from Novartis who make a drug for this disease. So this is, but these are real people. So I'm going to try and move to that.
My name is Tricia, and I'm 50 years old. I live in Hartselle, Alabama with my husband and our 3 sons and our daughter. Until recently, my 3 sons and I were undiagnosed, and the symptoms that we had were pretty much every day, and they were a red, bumpy rash that can be painful, joint pain, fatigue, fever, chills. Exposure to cold seemed to make it worse, and we've pretty much lived every day with it. What we learned is this is a disease that's called CAPS. It is familial, which means that it runs in families. My mother had it, my grandmother, my great-grandmother. It took so long for our family to be diagnosed because CAPS is such a rare disease. This is our story. As a little girl, it was difficult. I had to deal with the outbreak of a rash that was painful sometimes, the joint pain, the fever, fatigue. Those symptoms can wear on you. The pain is so hard to describe, but very real. And I can remember coming home from school up into my teenage years and just hurting. The mornings, you know, are pretty good, but by the end of the day, whether it was in high school or, you know, a job, or I worked before we had our children, joints hurt, fingers, wrists, knees, ankles hurt. So just to move hurts. And then this is a picture of her with her mother, which is my grandmother. And your great-grandmother? Because my mother had had it, and her mother, and my great-grandmother, and they had never seemed to find out what it was. There just didn't seem to be a lot of ways to go about finding it and finding out what it was and being diagnosed. And, you know, I would mention to doctors on occasions, but nobody ever seemed to know what it was. It just was a mystery. When my friend...
Okay, I think we'll just pause that there. Okay, so this was back in 2001, and you know that lady describes very much the predicament my family was in. And as I said, we had no treatment. We had no idea what had caused this disease. We knew it was genetic. Half her family had it, so it's so-called autosomal dominant, meaning that you can get it from one affected parent. That each, if you have the disease, you have a 50% chance of passing it on to your child. But that's essentially all we knew. She'd seen many doctors, as these patients often do, and they never really helped them. And the mother was desperate and said, "You've got to do something for me. And I want you to study me. I want you to find out what's going on." And you know, and I was like, well, you know, this is going to be pretty difficult. You know, no one's ever understood this disease. And so in a panic, what doctors normally do when they don't know what to do is they take blood. So I got her and her whole family to come in and give me blood. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I just took blood and we stored it and subsequently extracted DNA. So the mother came in with her children, and her brother and sister came in. And as you can imagine, I don't know if you, I mean, we all come from families, and they can quite often be somewhat dysfunctional. The ended up with a huge argument going on in the outpatient department and people storming off. But I had 5 vials of blood after this afternoon, and the uncle said to me, he said, "You know, you're not going to be able to help me. You know, people have been interested before, but no one's ever helped us." And I was like thinking, well, you're right. You know, it might help me, but it's almost certainly not going to help you. I mean, we had something that we knew was incredibly rare. This was definitely, now we kind of know it's about 1 in a million people have this disease. But for whatever it was, we knew this was an incredibly rare disease with no hope and no treatment. So this is essentially all we knew back then. So that all the patient, it runs in families, they get these daily hives, they get this thing called amyloid, which I'll talk about a bit later on, but essentially, if you get that, your kidneys can stop working. And about half the people also had deafness. And that's all we knew, and nothing worked. All the usual poisons we use to try and damp down inflammation didn't work in this disease. So a few months later, and we've moved from the UK, we're now in San Diego, in our Golden State, and a gene is found in Muckle-Wells syndrome. So they found mutations in a gene and also another thought to be unrelated disease called familial cold autoinflammatory syndrome. So one gene is mutated in two diseases. So suddenly there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe if we can understand what's happening on the sort of molecular level, maybe we can understand what maybe can help these patients. So as you know, I like history, so I'm going to give you a little history lesson now. So in 1948, while Aneurin Bevan was founding the National Health Service in the UK and Harry S. Truman was winning his election, a disease called familial cold urticaria was described. So this was written, and basically these hives, and the patients also had joint pains. So they're hives and joint pain. And then in 1962, a different disease, or thought to be, here's the Rolling Stones, they're just conquering America, and here's Kennedy dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, Dr. Muckle and Dr. Wells in England describe a family from a place called Derbyshire in the middle of England with this three-pronged disease, hives, deafness, and this amyloid. And then 2 decades later, while DeLorean is making his fabulous sports cars and Spain is hosting the Soccer World Cup, another disease, which we call NOMID, it stands for neonatal onset multi-system inflammatory disorder, so you can see why we like to call it NOMID, was hives again, really severe joint problems, joint destruction, those are the knees, and sort of neurological problems, headaches and neurological impairment. So we had 3 completely different syndromes, or so we thought. But there were some similarities. You know, they all kind of get hives, so there's the medical term for hives, urticaria, okay? And, you know, there's like deafness, and there's some joint stuff going on here, and there's some neurological inflammation as well. So it turns out that, in fact, they're all one disease. And the reason that they were called something different is that these are so rare, most doctors had never heard of any of these diseases, and most doctors would never see a second patient with them. So it's a 1 in a million disease. And of course, you know, so people described what was essentially the same thing, but some people are very affected very severely, so that would be on this kind of end, and then some are kind of sort of mild, where they're getting more sort of just the hives and the joint pains and a bit of headache. And it sounds like the lady in the clip we just saw was probably in this kind of thing. Still a miserable disease, but not quite as impaired as the patients with NOMID. And we now have a new name, so she was talking about in the video, called CAPS, which stands for Cryopyrin-Associated Periodic Syndrome. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that, because this gene, which has got this memorable name, NLRP3, makes a protein called cryopyrin that is damaged in this syndrome. And now I'm going to teach you some immunology that this is like half of the whole of immunology on one slide, okay? So I'm going to talk you through this. So we have an immune system to help us fight bad things, infections and cancers, and sort out danger. Okay, so this is a cell, okay, and we have a system to protect us from bad things going on. Now, here is cryopyrin. This is a normal person. We all are sitting here now with our cryopyrin like this. I put in the British flag because it's in a state of repression. Not because we found the gene, but because it is now repressed and it's not causing inflammation, okay? And that's how we're resting. We're quite happy. But bad things happen to us. These might be chemical toxins, it could be virus particles, this is a bacteria. And they come into the cell and they interact with things which are called DAMPs and PAMPs, but they're essentially just sensors that are looking for danger. And once they detect that, they send a signal to cryopyrin and it unfolds. Now, when it unfolds, it now becomes sticky and will stick to other unfolded cryopyrins. So we've had this signal come in, it's changed the cryopyrin, now it's all stuck together, and it's formed a molecule called an inflammasome, okay, which is part of how we fight badness. This interacts with a few other molecules, and essentially it activates this thing called interleukin-1 beta, which is a chemical that we all make when we're sick. So anytime you've had flu, anytime you've sort of hit yourself, if you had psoriasis, if you had some acne, we see interleukin-1 in pretty much all inflammatory states. Okay. And that becomes activated. And once this chemical is out in the system, this is what's causing inflammation throughout our body. So this pathway sort of explains the whole thing. So what happens for these patients is, rather than having that repressed cryopyrin, which is normal and only activated when we're in danger, their cryopyrin's always unfolded, it's always sticking together, so they're always getting inflammation every day of their life. Every minute of the day, they've got inflammation going on because of the way that their protein kind of unfolds. So, let me see. Okay, so this is kind of a simplified thing. So this is a normal pathway. So we have sensors in the cell looking for danger. If they sense it, they activate cryopyrin, it unfolds, it sticks together, and then these things get set off. This is a caspase, this is one of the molecules. Then interleukin-1, I put it in a sort of thunder lightning. This is what's causing inflammation, and there's receptors in the body that respond and gives us things like fever and swellings. So that's all you need to know about cryopyrin syndrome. That's all the molecular. It's a very simple disease, in fact. Okay, so now I'm going to take you back to the story. So, November we had a gene. Okay, so we now know where to look for them, and I'm just going to show you, so I decided I'd go on a hunt for these patients. So this is King's Lynn. This is where I started. So I had 5 patients there. And then I found a second one in Southend on the coast, and that was just a single patient. Okay. And then it turns out in my main hospital, some of the other dermatologists were hiding a patient from me who actually had the syndrome, who was walking through my clinic, and they didn't tell me. And as this is a 1 in a million disease, that was kind of unlikely. But anyway, I found another patient in my own hospital. Okay. Then there was a pretty severely affected patient in the west of England who was on his own but had a family history. Okay. And then I had another patient in Suffolk. So we had all these patients, and I just want to say that the difficult thing is that this disease, a lot of patients have hearing impairment, and they've seen a lot of doctors. They had this weird thing from birth. They see doctors, they never help them. The doctors only hurt them. They'll take blood and do tests, but they've never helped them. So actually the patients are very, very tough because they live with these horrible symptoms every day. They're often in adult life kind of fed up with seeing doctors because they've never been helped. And there's also, a lot of deafness. So these patients are quite isolated and actually very wary of seeing doctors. So the trouble I went to get to see these families was immense, because most of the time they're saying, no way, I don't want to see anyone. We've had our hopes dashed in the past. We know you're not going to help us. And it was a real struggle to get to see them. As there was a patient in the middle of England who said he would come, I could go and see him, and then he said, no, I don't want to see you. And then eventually he did get seen, but it was a real struggle. I mean, this took a few years, but I saw them, we catalogued their symptoms, and we got their blood. Okay, and we found a few others. And in fact, by this point, we were up to 6 families, and we were now sort of looking at the gene, and we found that of those, they all had mutations in cryopyrin, and we found 4 different mutations in different areas. Okay, and then that patient sort of refused to come back again. So we suddenly had a gene, so there was like some hope. And then the family was saying to me, well, look, why doesn't a drug company just invent a drug for us? And I was like saying, well, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to develop a drug, and you have an incredibly rare disease. the economics of it, they're not really going to be interested in developing a drug. They want to develop drugs for rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis and acne because they're big. This disease was incredibly rare. But it turned out that my colleagues in London, then 2 years later, a drug that was licensed for rheumatoid arthritis called anakinra, that actually blocks the interleukin-1, which is the bad guy in CAPS, they sort of reported 2 patients they treated with really good resolution of their symptoms. So suddenly 2 years later, there seemed to be some sort of hope for these patients. So we were now amassing quite a few of the patients, and this was my main hospital at the time, Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital, and with St John's, which is the big skin hospital in London, and the Royal Free, which is a teaching hospital that I'd worked in my medical days. They were experts in amyloid, and amyloid is one of the other things in this disease I'm going to tell you about. So the sort of 3 of us, we combined and we found all these families, and we did genetic testing, and we found they all had mutations. And indeed, by this point, we're up to 22 patients, okay, from 13 families. This is the gene which makes the protein cryopyrin. So we had now 5 mutations in these families. So what did the disease look like? And really, it was strikingly similar. Because as I say, most of the time, doctors never see this, and if you see one case, you'll never see another. But it turns out, and in fact, this lady was, in our clip just now, was just saying that, that she was saying, like, the mornings, not so bad. That's a very characteristic feature. Get up, not feeling too bad. As the day progresses, you get this rash. Doesn't really, now hives, who's had hives here? Okay, quite a few. Is it itchy? Yeah. This isn't itchy, but it looks like hives, So there's the first sort of tip of it. Hives, generally itchy, like atopic dermatitis from last week, itchy. But this, although it looks like that, wasn't itchy. And this lady beautifully described it much better than me. Said, it kind of hurts, and it's kind of a burning sensation. The hives, so real regular hives, they come and go. Blotchy rash, there for a few hours, go somewhere else. And in that respect, this is similar. This is a rash that comes and goes, but it gets worse as the day progresses. So if you're ever doing a clinic for these patients, you don't want to do it in the morning. You want to do an evening clinic, because that's when you're actually going to see the disease at its worst. And, it's quite a sort of pretty little rash. Little pink, sort of flat blotches on the skin. Often see it on the limbs. Here's some on the trunk. Doesn't look like typical hives, but we're struggling as dermatologists to try and lump it into something, and we're kind of saying, well, it's a blotchy rash that comes and goes, so we think of hives. But it kind of looks quite sort of like figurate, little petals, flower-like, which is different. This is another patient with it, this looks more like typical urticaria as compared to that. But these are all patients with this disease, with CAPS. Here we are, it's pretty subtle here. This is like the flank, and you can see these little pink sort of marks. And then sometimes it can look pretty dramatic. And this is another patient. So it certainly can look different in different people, and it will look different throughout through the daytime. So what did we find? So we had the 22 patients. Well, virtually all of them had onset at birth. They had some sort of rash. And again, virtually all of them had flu-like symptoms. And I kind of see this disease, it's like having flu, but every day of your life. Because you have joint pain, you have fever, they have, of course, rash. They would get so tired, a lot of the patients, that by 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, they'd have to wrap themselves up in blankets and just collapse and go to sleep. And then the day would start again, they'd be kind of okay in the morning, and it would get progressively worse throughout the thing. So most of them had joint stuff. Okay, we actually found, about a quarter of them had fertility problems too, which actually subsequently improved. Another sort of feature is they have red, inflamed eyes. Didn't really have visual problems, but this wouldn't be every day. The rash was pretty much every day, but 3 or 4 days a week they'd have red eyes. This is looking at the fundus. It's looking within the eye, and basically they have raised intracranial pressure. So like the blood pressure in the central nervous system was raised in about a third of them, and they had terrible headaches. And here's, we found just over half had some degree of deafness, certainly hearing impairment. Not everyone, but a lot of them. Okay, so I've alluded to the mysterious amyloid. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about amyloid. So amyloid is a protein that we make when we have inflammation. So again, any of us here, when we have inflammation from the flu, we'll make some of this amyloid. But then we get better, the amyloid disappears, and it's not a problem for us. These patients have inflammation every day of their life. So they make tons of amyloid. And about a quarter of them, we don't know why 1/4 and 3/4 don't, but this amyloid can actually lay down in different organs, and commonly it can actually lay down in the kidney. Is this a problem? Yeah, because it stops the kidney from working. So, I mentioned the first family I had, her mother had died from kidney failure, and we found sort of, a quarter of our patients had kidney problems. One who required a dialysis, another one actually had a transplant. This is a scan, a nuclear medicine scan, and it's actually, so this is the body. If you can sort of see, there's the head and the arms, there's the bladder. And this is actually showing deposits of amyloid in the kidney and in the adrenals, in the adrenal glands. So that was done in London in the Amyloid Centre. Okay. So I said we had 2 patients who were treated, so of course we wanted to treat all the patients. And this is where it really was unbelievable. And I think at this point we really were at the point of a magic bullet, because all of their symptoms went within 6 hours. This was a disease that they were born with. Every day of their life was flu-like and pretty miserable. Within 6 hours, there was no rash. There was no joint pain. The fevers had gone. The energy had come back. And the patients described it as being reborn, because they'd never known what it's like to be normal, because they always have a ton of inflammation. Not only that, the amyloid, which had laid down in these organs, like in the kidneys, which normally is kind of sort of fatal and certainly not reversible, resolved. Not within 6 hours, but over months, because the inflammation was gone. Gradually that amyloid could get rid of. Okay. And this is a graph which shows, so we measure, so this is the amyloid level, so you can measure that in the blood. A blood test that I'm sure a lot of you have had is called a CRP. It's a measure for inflammation that we generally order when we think people are unwell. And this is a similar sort of blood test. So it measures inflammation. It's a non-specific. This is a log plot. So they're running, before treatment, amyloid levels of 100, we'll say. The normal is less than 5. Okay? And this is about 5 here. So again, within 6 hours, their blood goes entirely back to normal. They have no symptoms whatsoever. Now, the problem with the drug was that it has a very short half-life. It's an injection under the skin, and it lasts for about 24 hours before the symptoms start to come back. And what anakinra does, so this is our drawing again of this pathway, so the sensors, cryopyrin, which is switched on in these patients. So basically, anakinra sits here. So when the interleukin can't bind its receptor, so therefore it can't enact the damage. And that's what it's blocking there. But it was a daily shot, which, the patients, of course, loved because they were well. They didn't like getting a daily shot, but, they were suddenly well, and they'd never experienced that before. So then we kind of thought, well, wouldn't it be great if we could get something that lasted longer than a day? And we were then approached by Novartis, which was making a drug called canakinumab. It wasn't called canakinumab back then. It was called AZZ885. That's what drugs tend to be called before they get some catchy sort of name. And basically, this was a drug, it's a monoclonal antibody that was specific to the molecule. So not the receptor, that's where anakinra is, it's going to the molecule itself. And we thought, well, that sounds like a great idea, because monoclonal antibodies, they tend to last about 8 weeks before they kind of degrade. So we started a clinical trial. And it wasn't called canakinumab, but that was the thing. And basically, the patients were given an IV infusion of the drug. And then we will wait to see when their symptoms come back. We didn't know if it was going to work, but we'll see if they get into remission. We'll wait to see if their symptoms come back. When their symptoms come back, when they relapse, we'll give them a smaller dose, and then that would be kind of the end of the study. So the average antibody lasts 8 weeks. So that you can see, right, 8 weeks, 16 weeks. So it was a 16-week study. I was about to come to the United States when we started this study. And anyway, we gave the infusion. Antibody only lasts 8 weeks. And 6 hours later, patient's not that much better. You know, anakinra works fantastically, 6 hours. The patient's not so good. We'll say, you know, go and sleep on it overnight. Next morning, they're perfect. So it took a little bit longer. It took like 12, 18 hours, but they were fine. They looked great. So we were following them every week. And they come in, and one of my patients, well, all 4 patients were I'd found in the UK, and we started them on the drug, and they'd come in week 1 and feeling great, and we'd take their blood and it was normal, and then we'd see them at week 2, and we'd take their blood and it was normal, and we kept on doing this, and the study was meant to last 8 weeks. Well, we got to 8 weeks, and they're still doing fine. They haven't relapsed. So then it gets to 12 weeks and 16 weeks. Now the patient's becoming anemic because we're taking so much blood, but they still are fine. And the patient's saying, am I cured? And I was like going, well, I don't think so. We've not changed your DNA. You still have the thing, but they're still doing fine. So the patients actually went into remission for 6 months after 1 infusion of the drug. So, I mean, this exceeded our expectations because the antibody would have disappeared after 8 weeks. Then we gave them a much smaller infusion, like a lower dose, I think 1/10 of the dose. And then they still, at a really tiny dose, still had remissions, had sustained effect for about 3 months. We then switched it over to subcutaneous, and now it's actually a shot once every 8 weeks. Okay. But here, let me show you. So this is what happened. So this is, just before we start, there's a load of rash. Okay. These are the blood markers. So there's the amyloid, there's CRP. Okay. And these are massively high. These are just random ones we've done before, just giving you an idea. They're all huge. And then, basically go down to normal and just start at about day 200, start climbing up again. Gradually, the patient started to feel tired, a little bit of rash. It wasn't like anakinra, the first drug, which when 48 hours after you have a shot of anakinra, your rash and symptoms are back with a vengeance. But for these patients, it just very gradually, they were kind of like, yeah, I'm not feeling quite, I'm 98%, and yeah, I had a bit of rash the other day. So it gradually sort of comes up. But you can see there's the rash, there's the eyes going back to normal. Okay, so it was a tremendous privilege for me. This is me back at the start of my dermatology career with this horrible disease, his family looking at me, sort of desperately wanting hope, which I could not give them. A few months later, this paper comes out in Nature Genetics from Dr. Hoffman in San Diego, finding a gene. My colleagues in London writing a case report in the New England Journal with the first drug, the anakinra, the drug for rheumatoid arthritis, seeming to help. We then collected all these patients, 23 patients, which is a lot in this disease, and described what was going on with them and their response to treatment with anakinra. Then another drug, also by Dr. Hoffman in San Diego, they found another drug that also blocks interleukin-1. So there's 3 drugs, and that's called Arcalyst, which I've not mentioned for the sake of time. But this drug also blocks the same pathway, gets similar results, although it's a shot every week. And then this is the study that we were involved with here, and I think this was with the drug canakinumab, which its trade name is Alaris, and that ultimately led to the licensing 2 years ago of the drug. So we really went from nothing to actually 2 licensed drugs for an incredibly rare disease, where we had no idea what was causing the disease, to a kind of totally understanding it. And this pathway is actually important in many common diseases, not just CAPS. It's actually the pathway in gout. rheumatoid arthritis, asthma, psoriasis. All of them have kind of inflammation in this pathway too, but they're not as clean as this model. But it taught us a lot about it. So, okay. So I'm now going to take a few minutes of questions before the second part of my talk. The question was about hearing loss. And in fact, that was the one thing that was not, did not come back for most patients. So that seemed to be permanent. So there's definite sort of permanent symptoms, and if you've had severe neurological involvement, you can't reverse that neurological involvement. But the headaches go and the rash goes and things like that. There have been now a few cases where the hearing has improved after sustained treatment. But it's a very good question, because that was the one thing which was kind of sort of flummoxing us, that we didn't get full resolution. So for most of them, it did not improve. There have been a few cases where it has. Okay. Yeah.
So I was just wondering how the drug companies decided to make the drug, because originally you were saying that so few people have it that it wouldn't be really financially.
Yeah, it's a great.
So why did they do it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I honestly believe that they wouldn't do it. So it turns out that because this interleukin-1 pathway is so important in lots of common inflammation, and these patients have basically, they're the perfect human models for interleukin-1 excess. They become from a scientific perspective, a very interesting population to study. And because you can actually get a dramatic response. So they were very invested in developing the drug and then getting it licensed for that indication. Of course, they're doing many other studies in commoner diseases, which, of course, I mean, it's hard to make an economic argument for, these drugs if they're only going to treat 1 in a million. I can tell you that this drug is about $100,000 a year. And indeed, the other drug that I didn't mention, but I just showed you, called Arcalyst, is, I think, $250,000 a year. Now, if these drugs turn out to be useful for common diseases, you can expect that to massively reduce in price. There's still going to be expensive drugs. There's still going to be, we have other sort of biological therapies, which generally about $20,000, $25,000 a year. So they might come down to that level. So I think it was kind of, they were really invested in this as a sort of from a scientific perspective. And of course, they, hope that they can develop it for other treatments. So I was kind of surprised that they did it, and very happy for our patients that they did, because, that is a huge investment from them. Yes?
The original family, has any of them had children?
So not as far as I'm aware with the original family. However, there have been cases of people conceiving shortly after the start of therapy. And essentially, certainly from a male perspective, so there was sort of both male and female subfertility. So, men, if they have flu, they become essentially sort of subfertile for a bit. If you have a fever, often the sperm count goes down. And then once you get over your flu, the sperm count goes up. And I think we didn't prove this, but I suspect probably that although the patients weren't infertile because there were lots of families with them, there may well have been they were kind of subfertile. And once, you just deal with the inflammation, I think that sort of fertility may improve. And certainly there was some timing of starting therapy and conception that suggested that might be the case.
And there's no passover to the babies?
No, but the problem is that if you have the disease, you have a 50% chance of giving it to your offspring, because we have 2 genes for everything. And you just need 1 bad gene. So any patient with CAPS has 1 bad gene. They have a 50% chance of giving it to the offspring. And indeed, before we had sort of, genetics and treatment and things like that, some patients, because they were so miserable with the disease, they didn't want to have families because they didn't want someone to suffer from that disease. I think certainly in the last few years since we've had therapy, that's become less of a concern, because at least they have the reassurance that there are treatments that are effective. Yes?
Out of curiosity, if in untreated disease you have this limited fertility, that would make the disease somewhat self-limiting. Now with the treatment of it, are you increasing the fertility, thereby increasing the incidence of the disease?
It's a very good question, and it's so rare that I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. But you're right. I mean, I think, you know, certainly conception appears to be somewhat easier now. So, but, you know, we're still dealing with a disease. I think there's about 300 people in the United States. So it's about 1 in a million sort of thing. Having said that, I think actually there's probably quite a lot of other people who had mild disease and they gave up, like a lot of my patients had. They kind of given up seeing doctors. So, but it is truly a very rare disease. So I don't think we'd see a huge explosion even with effective treatment. Yes?
Did you find any genealogical or ethnic sensitivity to people who have this?
No, I mean, so when we started studying it in the United Kingdom, you know, it basically was coming from our, you know, indigenous gene pool there, so predominantly sort of Anglo-Saxon. But it's been described in every ethnic group, and I've certainly seen Pacific Islanders, African Americans, Caucasians, Middle East. So there's no particular predilection. And there's no sometimes in rare genetic diseases, there's a thing called the founder effect, where, you know, a 16th century person had a lot of offspring and they, you know, you can trace back, you know, in gene pools. It's not really the case with CAPS that we see that. About half the patients don't have a mutation in the gene, and in the gene that we know causes the problem. So it may be that they have genes which are close by, proteins that interact and do the same job. They make too much interleukin-1. So we may be missing those. Yes?
Once the study's over, and who ends up paying for these enormous...
Yeah. That's a very good, and it was a big concern for me too, because I was very worried that, you know, our patients wouldn't have access to the therapy. I mean, you give them a taste of normality and then you take it away. I have to say that, so in each of the healthcare, so these drugs are licensed in the United States and in Europe. So they tend to be paid for by whatever the, you know, the health insurance system is. So in the UK, it's the National Health Service. In the United States, generally the, you know, regular medical insurance will pay for this. With biological therapies, of which this is a very expensive one, but they all cost a minimum of $20,000, all of the companies set up patient support programs. So if patients are found to be needing the drug company and there is no money to pay for the drug, that they support getting the drug for that patient. So it's, you know, from a doctor's perspective, you have to do a lot of form filling and a lot of calls. But generally you can get, certainly I've not yet had a patient either in the United States or in the UK who've not actually got the treatment. But it is not easy, but it is achievable. And I think this also speaks to the fact that we did some pretty rigorous studies, and often you know, insurance companies will deny you treatment because they say, well, you know, there's no evidence that it works. Well, we've done some very rigorous studies which helped our patients immensely, because we had, you know, papers in important journals, well-conducted studies, and we said, well, it does work. And not only does it work a little bit, it works amazingly well. And, you know, if a patient had the misfortune of getting renal failure, which they have about a 1 in 4 chance, you know, dialysis itself is, I don't know the exact figures, but I should imagine it's many hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in cost. So, so we have managed to get coverage, but it's not easy.
They don't say pre-existing condition or anything?
I haven't had that yet. It's a real concern, though. Because, of course, in reality, it's always a pre-existing condition because they've had it since birth. Right. Or since, you know, indeed since conception, presumably. So, But we haven't had a problem with that so far. Okay, well, maybe I'll take one more question, then we'll move on.
You mentioned that this disease has some relationship to rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis. I was wondering whether any of the drugs that are effective, say, for RA, would by chance turn out to be useful for this thing as well, or vice versa.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the first drug that we used, actually called anakinra, is licensed for rheumatoid arthritis. It's not licensed for this disease. So it was kind of like, my colleagues in London said, let's try it out. And it worked amazingly well for them. So that was an off-label use. So it works that. The problem with anakinra is it's not such a great treatment for rheumatoid arthritis. It works for about a quarter of the patients. And we actually have generally better treatments which block other important molecules. So generally it works better for that. So far we've not seen these drugs to be effective for psoriasis. So I think the problem with rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis is they're very complex diseases. So you get a ton of inflammation in lots of different pathways, of which one part might be a little bit of interleukin-1, which I think, because if we measure it, it's elevated. But there's lots of other sort of things throwing into the mix. And therefore, when you try to treat these patients, often you get some response or not a complete response, or indeed sometimes no response, because you kind of targeted the wrong thing. The beauty of this disease is it was all in one pathway. It became from this mysterious disease, we suddenly found one pathway, and it was super simple then. But certainly there's lots of research going on with these kind of drugs in rheumatoid arthritis and things like that. And I think that is the hope that, they will be effective in common diseases too. Okay, so I'm now going to move to the old. And here we are, talking about mummies. Okay, so I've moved from the United Kingdom to the United States with a former president. And I just want to put up a little, this is Juanita, who is a mummy, I think from South America. If I were a single man, I might ask that mummy out. That's a good-looking mummy. Who said that? Pre-Lewinsky, he said that. Yes, good old, another president. So we are now going to be talking about mummies. Okay, and it sort of really panders to my interest in history. And I think Ross very eloquently said it, far from being mute, ancient remains bear eloquent testimony to those who know how to listen, or how to see, I suppose. Okay, so what is the etymology of mummy? Here, looking at a very sort of tarry appearance. Visitors to Egypt noticed that mummies, they thought they were covered in resin, black resin. The Arabic word for tar or bitumen is mumia. So that's how we got the term mummy. And we have various types of mummy. We have accidental, intentional, artificial. This is Otzi, who was an accidental mummy, I think 5,000 years old in the Austrian Alps, found I think about 10 years ago by some hikers. And this is Ginger from the British Museum. I'll be talking about him in a moment. Okay, and this is one of the pharaohs, Ramesses. So, and one other thing that you should know about sort of preservation is this thing called adipocere, where you get accidental preservation. Okay, and it's also called grave wax, mortuary fat, corpse cheese, and it was described by Sir Thomas Browne, and it's where in your decomposing corpse the sort of fatty acids hydrolyze, and you essentially turn into soap. I'm just going to read a little bit, hang on, about this. This is from Sir Thomas Browne in his discourse Hydrotaphia Urn Burial. In a hydroponical body, 10 years buried in a churchyard, we met with a fat concretion. where the nitre of the earth and the salt and lixivious liquor of the body had coagulated large lumps of fat into the consistence of the hardest castle soap. So you can become preserved just if you have the right environmental conditions, often in kind of sort of moist sort of areas, you can kind of become soap, and this is an antibacterial thing. So some people have been mummified through chance. Okay, but of course we think about mummies in Egypt, and indeed this is where the earliest intentional mummies were. And what they did was they would sort of bury them out in the desert in little pits, and the heat and dryness and sand would dehydrate the bodies quickly, and then you would get this. And this is one of the oldest mummies in the world. This is Ginger from Egypt in the British Museum. Ginger because it has ginger-coloured hair. And then as ancient Egypt developed, rather than just putting it in pits, because the problem with this is that the jackals and other critters would eat your loved one, so that wasn't so good. So they decided that they would start, putting them in caskets. Now the problem with that is that now they weren't being desiccated, and they would start to decompose. And so they started designing ways of actually preserving the body where it didn't get eaten by jackals, but also, was preserved. So this is how the Egyptians did it. Okay, so first of all, you would embalm the body. And this would be taken at the temple, a place called Ibu. And the embalmers would wash the body with palm wine and rinse it from the waters of the Nile. Next would be evisceration. So an incision down the left-hand side would be made, and the internal organs would be taken out before they had a chance to decompose. Let's have a look at those organs. They would be washed. The heart was left in place. Don't mess with the heart. It's kind of sacred. But everything else was important. Things like liver and things like that were taken out and washed. Now, this organ here, the brain, wasn't very important. So they just scooped that out. They'd put sort of hooks through the nose and just throw away the brain. They weren't interested in that. But the organs, they were washed, and the heart was left there. And then they were put in natron, which is like sodium bicarb, and that would gradually desiccate the organs. And this would happen to the body too. So they'd be covered in this natron and stuffed with natron, and they'd be left for like 40 days as they gradually desiccated. Okay. This wouldn't be a dermatology talk if I didn't talk about using emollients. So we have to moisturize the body, so they'd be moisturized in oil, a bit more palm wine, and then they would be sort of plumped up a bit. Okay. Getting ready now, they're stuffing things in, stitching things in, putting on good smelling oils, and now it's ready to be wrapped in linen. Now, what they would do is you'd be buried with your canopic jars. And these was where the organs were stored. So there was the Imsep, who's the sort of human-headed god who looked after the liver. There's the baboon-headed god Hapith, who had the lungs. Quebeseneth, Falcon, took care of the intestines, and Duamutef take care of the stomach. So there you'd be buried with your organs intact. And indeed, all the sort of wrappings and everything was buried with you, had to be intact. Okay. Right, and there's good old Juanita. Okay, so what do we know about mummified skin? I have to bring it back to dermatology now. Okay, so it's actually very well preserved. Okay, it's shrunken, deeply pigmented and brittle, but can be surprisingly robust. And indeed, even though it's been exposed to harsh environmental conditions and chemicals often, it's still there. This is a British Museum mummy. Okay, and this is the toes, and you can see it's a little bit blurry, but I think you can appreciate they are the dermatoglyphics. They are the fingerprints of this. So that's from a mummy that's 4,000 years old. And indeed, not only just looking at it with our eyeballs, if we look under the microscope, so take a pathological slide, we can actually have a look at some structures. Now, this is very dry, and when we look at slides, when we're doing pathology and looking at tissue, you have to hydrate the tissue. Remember, this is very dry by definition. And by putting the stains that we actually do now, if we did a liver biopsy or a skin biopsy, we can actually identify a lot of the skin structures are still there 4,000 years later. So this is normal skin, okay? This is a modern day skin. We've got some, I know you all know this now because we've been talking about structures in the skin for a couple of weeks, but got the dermis, and this is the outside layer of the epidermis. And here we have the same. This is the dermis. Here's some collagen fibers, which disappear as we get older, okay? This is the basement of that, and this is the epidermis, and all these little black things are the nucleoli, and then you can see this is like the sort of keratin, which is becoming dust, which actually looks very similar to that. And indeed, in these patients, we've seen sweat glands and hair follicles, and all the things we see in modern skin. You can identify in mummified skin. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's surprising how well it can be preserved. So. And because of this, we can sort of actually appreciate quite a lot of skin disease in mummies that obviously were here many centuries before us, or millennia before us. And indeed, we've seen infectious diseases, infestations, cancers, inflammations, and trauma, and these are all described in mummies. So it's an absolute sort of potpourri for the historical paleodermatologist who should be interested. But these are some of the things that have been seen. So syphilis, leprosy, the plague, that's human papillomavirus, warts. Okay, a lot of fungus has been found. These are crab lice, head lice, leishmania, all of these things, often sort of infectious diseases, kind of hang around. You can kind of appreciate their structures, so they're relatively easy to identify. Which takes me to my first case. So this is Maria of Aragon, okay, the Marquise of Vasto. She was buried in a Naples Abbey and was exhumed in the early 1980s. She was famed for her beauty and moved in the same circles as Michelangelo in Renaissance Italy. And here's her today. So this is the body. And the first thing I want to point out to you, so this is a close-up of actually the vulva. Okay, so this is the vulva, sort of genital lesion. And you can see that there's this structure here, which is kind of poking out from the vulva. And this is actually what it looks like under the microscope. Any thoughts what this might be? This is a genital wart. And this is actually when they typed it, what types of genital warts are caused by a virus called HPV, human papillomavirus, it was actually type 18. So if Maria of Aragon had had Gardasil, she wouldn't have got it, because there was type 18, which is one of the types that Gardasil protects. Why is that important? Because type 18 has got a relatively high risk of cancer transformation. So they identified this in her. Now, here's the arm, and they found that there was a linen bandage on the left arm. I know that's not the greatest resolution, but you may appreciate there's a black thing here. That was actually an ulcer in the skin, a break in the skin. And when they looked under a very fancy microscope, the electron microscope, they saw a load of spiral-like structures. So they were kind of interested in what that was. And they did some antibody staining, and they found that there was a thing called Treponema pallidum. Does anyone know what Treponema pallidum is? Syphilis. They found syphilis in her. So poor Maria Aragon had genital warts and syphilis. And I would say to you, that makes me want to get a cremation. Because no one's going to examine me once I've gone. Right. So, back to Egypt. Ramesses V in the 20th dynasty reigned. He died in his early 30s, a young man, and he was pharaoh for 5 years. Okay, what did he die of then? Can you appreciate? So this is the mummified head, and here's a close-up of the cheek. Can you appreciate any abnormalities here? There's an example. All right, lots of little bumps there. You know, so he had smallpox. Okay, so you know, pox-like, sort of kind of like chickenpox, but obviously fatal. And so he had smallpox, and that was in his mummy. Okay, so we've seen infectious diseases, and we've also seen growths. Okay, and these growths, these are benign things. So dermatofibroma, you know, if I examine you all here, probably at least half of you I'll find a dermatofibroma. It's like a little scar to an insect bite. They've been seen in mummies. Okay, angiokeratomas, little vascular blood vessel growths, lipomas, I'm sure you've all heard about them, little fatty growths. They've all been seen in mummies. Now, there's also been some malignant growths. So basal cell cancer, there was one in the Duke of Naples, Duke Ferdinando Orsini. This is his palace in Naples of Palazzo Gravina, and he had a tumour in his orbit, just going into the side of his eye when they've exhumed his body. And there's also been reports of melanoma as well. So we've seen infectious diseases, we've seen tumours, both benign and malignant in mummies. Now, a big thing that we look for in dermatology and in medicine in general is inflammation, things like psoriasis and acne. Well, you know, we've not really seen very much of that. And this is probably a testament to the fact that infectious diseases, you can kind of identify them. You can look for DNA, you can see structures. But these are kind of more transitory, and we've not sort of seen them so much. So inflammation, not so much. But tumours, yes, and certainly infections. Okay. And we go back to I'm trying to link it with the first talk. Here's the screen. And an Italian anthropologist said there was a striking similarity. This is a mummy from a museum in Florence. And he thought that Edvard Munch got his inspiration having visited this museum in Florence from the mummy. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they say. Okay. So this takes me to the British Museum. And when I was training in the UK, I did a tropical medicine degree, which was right next to the British Museum. So I used to have my lunch in the British Museum. It's a beautiful place. It's one of the world's greatest museums, full of stuff that we've stolen from every known civilization over 300 years. And it's beautiful. So if you're visiting London, please go and see it. And they have a fantastic Egyptian exhibition there. So I would go off and have my lunch and be sitting there having a sandwich and could go and see the mummies. And I kind of thought, maybe it'd be a good idea if I went to examine their mummies. So I contacted the curator and I said, I'm a dermatologist, I'd love to have a look at the mummies. And I didn't think they would take me seriously. But, then he called me back and he said, sure, come on down. You can see our mummies. So I couldn't really quite believe it that he allowed me to. Now, you can't unwrap, the mummies in the caskets in the sarcophagi. You can't really unwrap them because they kind of disintegrate. But there are a number of mummies which were kind of sort of found in different places where they were already uncovered. So we didn't go and unwrap any mummies. No mummies were harmed in the making of this talk, I can tell you. We did not disturb any remains. Okay. But what we did find is that they had 4 mummies which weren't on public display. They had a huge back sort of storage area that we went to, and the sort of men in sort of like long brown coats would come and give us like things to examine for the whole morning. Then they would carry them off again. And they had 4 complete mummies from Egypt, and then there was a room full of bits and pieces from non-complete mummies. So I'm going to take you through the cases that we saw. So the first one was a female adult. Okay, so, they had dated the mummy in the sort of pre-dynastic period. from an area called Gibelin, which is near Thebes. So here she is, and sort of in a sort of fully flexed position. So we had a closer look. Okay, so I'm going to orientate you. This is the sort of hair, and these are the sort of, this is the finger pulp, and these are the nails. What are you struck by? That's nail, that's the hair. What colour is it? It's red. You know, you think that might be an unusual colour in Egypt. So we were kind of struck by that, and we wondered whether they were hennas. And indeed, henna had been used in ancient Egypt, so I wonder whether there was some henna going on there. So we thought that was probably the most likely thing. And when we were looking at the hair, okay, we saw this little white structure. Any idea what that might be? There's a few parents in the room, I suspect. Yeah, this little white structure. Lice, this is a modern day. Okay, that's the nit. It's the egg case in the hair. So we found some lice. Okay, this is the scalp. Okay, now this is actually the most exciting slide from a dermatological perspective, although it may be underwhelmed, because we can see scale here. Okay, there's sort of scale on the skin. Okay, so a scaly scalp, what would you call that? Dandruff. Okay, you know. Now, this person probably maybe had some dandruff. Is that exciting? You think, well, no. I mean, like dandruff's like, 50% of people have some dandruff. But as I say, inflammation disease is not normally seen in mummies. So this was actually because they don't tend to get preserved. So this was actually, although it was dandruff, it was actually kind of an interesting thing. And one other thing I thought about with the sort of henna is that you can actually become allergic to some of the sort of henna dyes. So the other possibility is they had an allergic reaction, which is possible. Okay. So then they sort of took away the first body, and then out came another big box. Okay. And this was also from Gibelin, and it's the body was very flexed in, and they'd been unable to determine the gender, but it's in the same period. Younger, adolescent. Here's me with my pen light having a look. And you can see that, first of all, that the skin's not in as well preserved as the other one. You know, you can see here the skull and things like that. But there was still quite a lot going on. Okay. So this is like from the shin. And we were struck by these little things, these little bumps here. Now, for those of you who are at the atopic dermatitis, actually you saw this same condition last week. It's not atopic dermatitis, but it's an associated condition. It's all little sort of follicular prominence. This thing called keratosis pilaris. So these are the rough bumps about 1 in 10 people have on the outside of their arms, sometimes on their thighs, can be associated with atopic dermatitis. So this patient had that. Okay. I want to orientate you. This is the ankle. Okay, so the foot's kind of over here. Yeah. This is the ankle. Okay. We notice this. Darkening and exaggerated skin lines. Ties in beautifully with last week's lecture. That's called lichenification. Okay, thickening skin line. Now, we don't know whether that was just a normal anatomical feature because, you know, the skin lines are a little bit more exaggerated there, or whether that person had an itchy condition which was exaggerating them further. So any condition where you want to scratch your skin, and you can try this for the rest of the lecture if you want. You can be rubbing a bit at your skin, and if you do that for a couple of weeks, you will get lichenification. Okay, and we see that in any itchy skin condition like atopic dermatitis or scabies, we can see exaggerated skin markings. So that patient, mummy I should say, had that. Okay. Then the third case was a male child. I'd estimate probably about 3 or 4. Now this was a much later mummy and was in good state of preservation. And so here we are in the box, and had this interesting sort of gold, so kind of blonde hair, and had this sort of gold gilt on the face. And then we looked at the looked at the nail, and there was this white line in the nail. And there is a condition called Bowes lines where you get white lines in the nail. And it's normally associated with some severe illness. So if you have chemotherapy or you become septically ill, the nail stops growing, you get a white line. So it's associated just with severe illness. So we postulated that maybe there had been something, and we know that that child actually had a brain fracture, because I didn't show you that, but they had done an X-ray some years ago, so they had a brain fracture. We don't know when that was, whether that was, the cause of the death, or whether it was subsequent, but we don't know. But they had Bowes lines, so we were kind of postulating what that could be. Okay, so the next case was a female child, which was, we're not sure if it was a relative, but it was found in the same place and very similar age. And we're again with this gold gilt. Okay, and this child had a big ulcer on her forehead. So we again don't know how that was, whether that was pre or post mortem, but that was something that we noticed in her. And then we were taken away from the big room, and we were taken into a little kind of like cellar room, where there was just like lots of pots and pans, and they just had bits of anatomy. And this was like a toe. And there's the nail, and I thought, well, that's an unusual looking nail. And so I think that was a so-called pincer nail, okay, which you sometimes see these abnormal curvatures in the nails. And then this was a hand, just like a solitary hand. And then they had all these kind of rough ridges on the nail. And we call that a thing called tracheonychia, that sometimes is seen as inflammation sort of thing. So we were hypothesizing that. So with that, I'm very pleased to answer some questions for you. Okay, let me just put that down. And that concludes my talk, but I'll answer questions for as long as you'll let me. Okay, yes, please. Sorry? Oh, henna.
Yeah, what is that?
So henna's a hair dye, sort of a red natural hair dye. So often often if you see sort of people with kind of like that reddish hue to sort of dark hair, that's often been used henna. So it's a product that's used, sort of natural hair dye that's used kind of worldwide really, and can be used on the nails. Yes, please.
A lichen, is that a plant?
A lichen?
Lichen.
Yes.
How does that get into the skin?
Lichen just means it's just so it's also a morphological description. So some things kind of look like they're like lichens stuck on the skin. So we have some medical condition called like lichen planus, but it's not actually a plant. It's just that it's a descriptive term for it. Yes, please.
In your interest in history, does it extend to, I've read about some physicians take a look at old paintings and, the facial features or the physiological features and sort of diagnose?
Yeah, there are some dermatologists who have done that, and they've certainly gone around the great art galleries and found things like rosacea and things like that. So I've not done that. I think I'm always on the lookout, but I actually have seen academic papers looking at sort of things in portraits of medical conditions. So, yes, please.
Can you talk more about tracheonychia?
Okay, yeah, tracheonychia. So it kind of looks like a washerboard nail. It's kind of like you've been like scrubbing away on it, sort of rough nails. It's associated with a few conditions. So one of them actually is lichen planus, which is a very itchy skin condition that sometimes affects the nails. There's another type called 20-nail dystrophy. So all your fingers and toenails get this. It's seen in children, and it tends to last for a couple of years. It could also be trauma. So if there was being trauma applied to that nail, that's also. So there's a number of things it could be. So tracheonychia is more the descriptive term rather than the underlying diagnosis.
But were you saying something about that it's a marker of inflammation?
Well, that's right. So if it, for example, they had this condition lichen planus that can give that appearance, this is an inflammatory disease that causes, typically on the skin, purple little itchy bumps, but on the nails can cause those ridges.
So it's not something that as you get older, your nails just get longer?
No. That's a different, so the nails kind of get more crumbly as you get older. So, basically at the sort of ends of the nail, they just becomes a little bit more sort of friable. But that would look different. That wouldn't give you all these deep little depressions and ridges in the nail. Yes, please.
Skin cancers. So they have seen, or you've seen evidence of skin cancers going back to these times. And, we tend to hear, ozone, increased skin cancer and so forth. And I know these are small samples, but do you have any thoughts about how far back it went, and is there any relationship to where it is today?
No, it's a very good question. I mean, of course, we don't have any real sort of epidemiology. We're just getting glimpses of what's preserved. So we can sort of hypothesize that we know these things were present, but we have no idea the prevalence. So I didn't show you the picture from the Duke of Naples, but he was, I think, in his 70s. He lived in Tuscany, or I suppose probably the Amalfi Coast or somewhere. So pretty sunny area. So we can hypothesize that he had ultraviolet exposure, and certainly we know that skin cancers have been around for millennia. Are they getting more common? Well, the answer is probably yes in the last 100 years since we've been collecting data, and since society has changed. I mean, 300 years ago, it was people would be wearing sort of parasols and big hats and would avoid the sun like the plague. And it wasn't until Coco Chanel in the 1930s came off saying that tans look great that we got into the whole tanning culture. As for ozone, I'm not sure. I'm sure it's not helping. Yes?
You showed us toenail fungus. What causes that, and what is the treatment today?
Okay, so I didn't know if he had toenail fungus, but I'm sure that did exist back there. So that's the $1 million question, and I'd be a very wealthy man if I could cure toenail fungus, and I'm not. So there are some treatments that are helpful. So generally, topical solutions, creams and things like that generally do not work, or there's a very, very slim chance of cure. There are various pills like Lamazil, or itraconazole, which are antifungal pills, that probably about half the time will cure the fungus. The problem is that there's still quite a large relapse rate, and these drugs go through the liver, so you have to sort of monitor them. So it's quite difficult to offer a cure. Having said that, there are more technologies becoming available, and whereas drug companies don't like to invest in rare diseases, toenail fungus is probably the commonest thing, and it affects relatively wealthy populations, and drug companies have invested millions every year in trying to get the sort of holy grail of an effective toenail treatment. There are drugs in phase 3 studies which are topicals, so that would be very attractive rather than taking a pill. But they're, at this moment in time, not licensed to treat toenail fungus. There's no evidence that I know of for lasers, although I know that they're heavily marketed and advertised as treatment for toenail fungus. So at sort of, March 2012, I'd say the best chance is an oral agent, of which it's going to have a significant failure rate.
What happens if you take the toenail off and let it grow back again?
Sometimes that's pretty drastic surgery. That can work, and sometimes people will have them removed, and then they'll put sort of antifungal creams and lotions on the area as the nail regrows, and sometimes that can get rid of it. But I think often if you have the predisposition to just get toenail fungus, which pretty much athlete's foot, which is the same fungus is ubiquitous. It's kind of around us and we can't really escape it. And if it's kind of got into the nail, it often tends to get back there.
Is it hereditary?
Not as far as we know. Not as far as we know. But it is very common. So, you often see it just in families because it's just very, very common. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. It's been a delight to talk to you.